Perhaps the most significant words in the history of literature and perhaps in the history of mankind are the words that the Bible states, or the Torah states, Vayelech Avram. Avram went. This is after God calls to him, and God says to Abram, "Go from your country, your birthplace, your father's house, to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all the peoples on the earth will be blessed through you." There are a lot of questions that this raises. First of all, who is this God that speaks to Avram? Avram would have known many gods in Samaria, and this could have been his paternal God, the God of his family. It could be the great God of Samaria, the sky God. God is referred to in 4 different ways, which certainly suggests that Avram is coming from a polytheistic background. We'll get more into that a little bit later. So this is a signal of a complete departure from everything that has gone before in this long evolution of culture. So out of Sumer, a civilized place of predictability, comes a guy who doesn't really know where he's going, but is going into the wilderness under the prompting of this God. Out of Mesopotamia, this land of self-serving merchants who use their gods to ensure prosperity and favor, comes a pretty wealthy caravan with no apparent material goal. So I think it's really interesting, this whole idea of imagining something new. There's this possibility that Avram is experiencing. So a couple things to know about Avram. Remember, Avram is his Sumerian name. Abraham will be the name that he gets when he fulfills the promise and finishes God's call. So Avram is Abraham. Now, Abraham was from the city of Ur, and if you look at Sumer, it's on the Euphrates River down there on the lower part of this map. So Ur was in really the heartland of the Sumerian Empire. And it was the place where the huge ziggurats were. It was the center of both commerce and the center of the religious practices in Samaria, which is interesting. But he's going to be called from Haran, and Haran is much further to the north. So it's interesting, it's thinking about where you might have to go for God to call you. You probably aren't going to hear God's call if you're in the middle of the city and you stay there and you're following your day-to-day routine. You may have to go a little further into the unknown, both in your own life and into the deeper parts of your or more remote areas of your country. So as we know from our earlier study of Samaria, Samaria was an urbanized place with a lot of trade, a highly materialistic culture, very competitive, not terribly moralistic. It was really about doing the best that you could for yourself. The religion was polytheistic, obviously. And if you look at Sumer, it has a lot of elements to it, but I think most importantly, it was a place where writing began to come into the picture. And this is important because you begin to get the writing of legal codes. And the legal codes really focus on protection of property and punishments for the things that might happen if that property is taken away. So if you look at Hammurabi's code, it really is about punishments for and protections for property and what happens if it's taken away. So obviously the connection between writing and religion is going to be extremely important because Judaism is going to be heavily based on the Torah and the written word, which comes out of that Sumerian tradition of writing histories and writing contracts and things like that. And as you can see, we'll see later, the Jewish religion is heavily based on the whole idea of the contract. So again, the Sumerian religion, polytheistic, gods that behave like humans. So this idea of projecting humanity onto the God form and the relationship between a man and God had already been established, but it was a very different relationship. This was really more where the gods were part of nature, a little bit more like Hinduism. They existed as functions of nature, not something above it. So if you look at the Sumerian worldview, broadly speaking, this was very much like Hinduism, a view of samsara, circular idea of reality, a flat world with a underworld and an overworld, sky world and a netherworld, focusing heavily on phases of the moon and changes in the season, focusing on menstrual cycles. It was quite a sexually expressive culture. A lot of rituals that revolved around pretty explicit sexual rituals as part of the practice. So Judaism is going to change significantly from that, a very different view of what God is and the relationship of man to God. So Avram is called by God in Haran. He goes north, and he's already there with a caravan. It's interesting because what the Torah tells us is that he was 75 years old when he is called. So he again, this is in biblical terms. So he's in middle age. He's a man who has not been able to have children, but he has a fair amount of possessions. So he has a caravan, and he brings his nephew Lot, including some slaves that he has. It's pretty clear. It says the people they had acquired in Haran. So either servants or slaves that were there with him. So he's called from this remote outpost to go somewhere, not exactly sure where. And again, who is this God that calls him? The voice that calls Abraham to Canaan is referred to as Yahweh, or the Lord. But later in the same section of the Torah, Abraham performs a circumcision at the request of a god named El Shaddai, or the Almighty God, also translated into the God of the mountain. And there's another reference to God as El Olam. So again, we're not quite sure which God it is, but Abraham is not one to ask questions. He is one to follow this voice, follow this intuition that this God can lead him not only to a new land, but also to his family, to his future. So this is really a very different view from the way that the Sumerians or the Hindus or any other people in the world would have thought at that time. From a Buddhist perspective, you're much better off sitting by the river, focusing on your own spiritual enlightenment. The same thing in Hinduism. You're better off avoiding these sorts of things. This is a kind of a distraction in the material world and something that could go horribly wrong. But Abraham has faith. He has a deep belief that this God is guiding him somewhere. And this idea of hearing that intuitive call is extremely important in this story. So Abraham is going to go. And in doing so, he becomes in some ways God's messenger. He goes into the wilderness to find this place that God has told him that he will go to, this place called Canaan. And so if you look at where Abraham is going to go, he's going to go all the way from Ur up through Haran, and then down into what was then the Egyptian Empire. So he's moving between the two major empires at the time. But in some ways, when he leaves the Sumerian Empire, he is leaving his old culture, not only the gods, but the whole civilization behind. I mean, it really is like he's going to the moon or something. This is a place that people didn't really know about. So this whole idea of this spiritual internal journey, which is based heavily on faith, is extremely important in the story. So if you look at, again, where he's coming from, this large urban environment, place where the ziggurats were, the home of the gods, he's leaving. This is where the gods resided. They resided in these ziggurats. So when you leave this place, You are leaving your gods and you're accepting this one other God as your God. So again, I referred to this a little earlier. Who is this God? We don't really know, and it's not clear that Avram really knows initially, but the key piece is that he is going to follow the call. It's the following that's the key piece. So if you think about the story, the place that God is calling Avram, the promised land, is southern Judea. This is it. This is Canaan. So you have to imagine, this is a guy who comes out of this extremely developed river valley civilization, out of Ur and out of Haran, out of a place where there are giant temples and cities and trade and all kinds of symbols of human success, to this place. This is the promised land. I mean, it's a desert. There's nothing here. And Avram has to handle this challenge of coming to a new place. He's not going to get his child right away. God is going to test him. He's going to have to fight through a lot of different things as he faces this call and what it means to him. So I think what's important here is, if you think about what's happening, is God is making an agreement with him. He says, if you go into this wilderness, I will give you a son and I will give you a nation. And in the face of everything that would tell Avram that this wasn't so, Avram continues to move forward. He continues to follow God's directions. So I think what this is really about is really listening to something at a very deep level. The prime religion, this is from Filer, the reading that you may have already done. This is the last part of that section. The prime objective of religion is to know God, but the only way to do that is to discover God within our own consciousness. This happened to Abraham, and it can happen to us. And anybody that happens to choose to live a life in accordance with God's practice. So we can all do what Avram did in some way. We can be called into a new place. And that place probably is not immediately going to look all that promising. But if you have faith in it and you believe that God is guiding you, that gives you a tremendous amount of strength. And it gives you the will to continue. So obviously, spoiler alert, Avram and his wife Sarai are finally going to have a son after a lot of other things happen. And we're not going to go into the whole story of Abraham right now. But the point of this is that this one-way contract, the contract between Abraham and God basically says, I'm not asking much from you other than you have to leave your home and your civilization. But I think it's important because this departure is really not only a departure towards monotheism, it's a new departure in the relationship between the individual and the God that individual is putting his faith in. And of course, as a result of this, Abraham will be the father not only of Judaism, but also of Christianity and of Islam. So he is going to be the patriarch of the three major Abrahamic religions. Arguably, the most important person to have ever lived, if you think about it culturally and historically and otherwise. So today, Abraham, again, was not a mythological person. He was a historical one. And he is buried in the tomb of the patriarchs. This is in Hebron, which is slightly south of Jerusalem. And to this day, this is one of the most sacred areas for all Jews, because and even for Christians and for Muslims, because it is where Abraham ultimately ends up, in the center of the place that was promised to him in Canaan, in Judea. And God makes good on his promise, all because Abraham believed in him.